Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone had a nice weekend, and welcome back to the rain. And welcome back to the water right change petition hearing for the California Waterfix project. I am Tam Dodek. With me to my right is board chair and co-hearing officer Felicia Marcus. I think we will be joined by board member Diadamo. We hope to have her join us. Otherwise, I know she'll be watching on the web if she's not here in person. To my left are Andrew Derringer, Connie Mietenhofer, and Jean McHugh. We're also being assisted today by Mr. Baker and Ms. Perry, as well as others in the mission control room back there. A couple of announcements, then we'll get to housekeeping. As you know, we are in a new location today, so please take this announcement seriously. Take a look around and identify the exit closest to you. You have 4 to choose from. In the event of an emergency, an alarm will sound. We will evacuate. There is no stairs to be taken because we're on the first floor, but please exit the building and we will regroup in the parking lot to wait for the all clear signal. Secondly, as always, this meeting is being webcasted and recorded, so please provide your comments by speaking into the microphone, and please begin by identifying yourself. For the court reporter's convenience, oh, by the way, the court reporter is here and she'll be recording, and the transcript will be made available at the end of part 2. If you would like to have it sooner, please make your arrangements with her directly. For her purposes, though, she will not be able to see who is speaking among those who are in the second row there for panel 2 witnesses. So as you are responding to questions or providing other comments today, if you could please announce yourself to her before you begin, or as you begin, that would be of tremendous help to her. Everyone else, of course, will do the same as they come up to the microphone to provide any questions or comments. I think I'm on my third and most important announcement. Please take a moment. Even though we are in a new location, this is still the most important thing you will do today, and that is take a moment to put all your noise-making devices to silent, vibrate, do not disturb, especially do not disturb the hearing officer. Please take a moment and check, even though you think it might be off. And I see the chair doing so. Thank you. All right, before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. I have to refocus because attorney's on this side instead of my usual right. Mr. Mizell, we had asked you, I believe, to look into the status of the department's response to Ms. Womack and Ms. Desjardins' PRAs.
Yes, thank you, Trip Mizell, DWR. We did search all of the requests that we've received from the Public Records Act, and at this time there are no outstanding Public Records Act requests from Ms. Womack. They've all been responded to. And as to Ms. Desjardins' subpoena, we were unable to locate any subpoena served upon us at this point, and we have not received any motion compel. Those were the 2 claims that I recall hearing on Friday. We also did a search of the PRA, and we believe we responded to her PRAs.
Before you begin, I understand that you may not, Ms. Womack, be getting the information you expect to get from the department as a result of your PRAs, but that is a matter for you to work out with the department. It's not a matter that we get involved in as a matter of enforcing PRAs. So keep that in mind as you respond. There should be a speak.
Speak.
And when the red light comes on, yes.
Okay.
Got it.
Yes. Thank you so much. No, there were November 14th. I gave 3 different PRAs to DWR, and they said they would respond to them, and they had voluminous text. I have all the documents here, and I'd be glad to upload them.
No.
Anyway, voluminous to me does not mean 2 documents, and they simply did not respond to anything about dredging and things that have very much to do with my case with access to waterways, to the river, and the rocking of levees. Very much to do with fishermen, my own fishermen at my place. And also in response to what was happening, I made a April 11th request to the then director for information. I didn't know it was a Public Record Act request at that point, but I did ask for information. I then restated it in a PRA, and I'm simply not getting public information like, did you, what timely manner did you let people know there was an emergency at Clifton Court?
Ms.
These
Womack.
kinds of things that
Ms.
I
Wom-
think is alarming.
Ms. Womack, a Public Request Act request is
Yes.
a request for documents.
Yes.
It is not a request for response to questions. It is not a request for inquiries to questions you might have. It's simply a request for documents.
Yes, and I've received documents after the fact from DWR and from people, from fellow protestants, that I think should have been provided by DWR, and I would be glad again to put these on the web to you. I'm just not getting documents from DWR.
Ms. Womack, two things. One, it is between you and DWR on the compliance issue of the PRAs. And two, documents that you discover, if they are appropriate and germane to the key hearing issues before us, if you believe they are part of your case, you could introduce that as part of your case in chief for part 2 or as part of your rebuttal.
One document I'm referring to.
And we are not going to go through the documents now.
Well, but I'm having trouble because I'm a landowner. I live next to a dam. I've only just been told it's a dam. I've been going on for a long time about it seeping, causing damage. No, I understand. But in March, it turns out that right where I have all the seepage, there's a huge problem. I've written the directors, all 4 of them in this last year.
Ms. Womack,
and no one has responded. Who do I respond to? Who do I go on
Ms.
to?
Womack, I appreciate that this is a forum to which you've been engaged in, but that is not an issue that we can help you with. This is something you will have to take up with the department.
So the fact that the department can simply not respond, and this is how they'll respond when the forebay
Ms.
at
Womack,
the intermediate forebay
Ms.
leaks.
Womack.
I just this is what I'm dealing
Ms.
with.
Womack, they have said they have responded to the extent that you disagree with their response. That, again, is a matter for you to take up with them. To the extent that you believe this is germane to a case before
Absolutely.
us, you may bring that up during your case in chief or rebuttal. Now is not the time.
I can't bring it up in my case in chief unless you allow me to put it in now because
No.
the time is over.
The time is over. You are too late to submit anything for your case in chief right now.
That-
but
that they
rebuttal is
withheld.
still coming up.
Well, you know, I
And Ms.
think it's-
Womack,
I
we
think
have
it's-
taken up enough time, and I cannot assist you with legal advice. That is a matter that you need to work out yourself.
This is a public. We the people. I am the person, along with the fish that you're protecting.
Yes, but you, as a party to this hearing, must abide by the rules and procedures, and that includes working within the time frame that we've set out, submitting materials by the deadline, and complying with the relevancy of the key issues that are before us. This is not the forum for you to bring up past grievances with the department.
But the department doesn't have to give me answers. That doesn't seem right.
The
It's-
department has said they have given you answer.
They haven't.
Now we are done.
Thank you for your time.
Ms. Desjardins. By the way, before you begin, I will acknowledge that you have a couple of issues before us that we will need a little bit more time, so we'll try to get back to you after the lunch break today regarding your requests for clarification of our last ruling, as well as, I think, a matter that you raised on Friday regarding a request that I took into consideration at the closure of Part 1. So those things are still outstanding. Also, I think you had a request with respect to subpoenas, and we will also get to that after lunch.
Thank you. There was before we get to the issue of PCFFA subpoena, and Mr. Mazzell, I'm going to give you a copy to refresh your memory. This is the subpoena filed on July 2016 by PCFFA. I did work with PCFFA to subpoena the documents. Please examine it while I bring up this other issue. I noticed when I was preparing an answer to support for Mr. O'Beege's two introduced exhibits that there appeared to be a discrepancy between the hearing ruling on February 21st, which stated that the Department of Water Resources in their written submission had said they will submit the supplemental EIR for the hearing record and make their parties available for cross-examination. And when I looked on the actual February 9th submission, it stated that they were proposing that the permit be issued based on the record in Part 2 and that the supplemental EIR would only be produced after the permit was
Dejan, are
closed.
you making an argument with respect to Mr. O'Beege's line of questioning and cross-examination exhibits and DWR's objection?
It's not an argument, it's just a factual matter about what the Department of Water Resources in fact said in their written submissions to the board, and I think it's an important factual point that be clarified.
And you may feel free to do that in whatever submission. You've made a submission to us already. Was that already reflected?
Yeah, yes, that is in
Then you
the
do not
written
need
submission.
to repeat it today. We will consider that along with all other responses that we will receive by 5 p.m. today.
Thank you. Mr. Mazzell, have you had a chance to review the PCFFA subpoena?
Actually, before you answer that, Mr. Mizell, this is PCFFA subpoena. Why are you pursuing their subpoena and not PCCFA's representatives? And by representatives, I mean their attorney.
Their attorneys are extremely overloaded and are not able to personally be here.
And you have taken it upon yourself to pursue their subpoena from 2 years ago?
No, I've pursued that subpoena consistently. There was, I filed a written request, which I have a copy of here.
And what standing do you have to do this?
I argue that I have standing because I filed a written request. I was told to file a subpoena. As a pro per, I cannot file an affidavit for a subpoena ducis tecum. The hearing counsel, Dana Heinrich, did contact me in response to this interrogatory about what information you're maintaining with regard to the development of the hydrologic modeling, that I needed to file a subpoena, and I worked with PCFFA's attorney because I was represented to file a subpoena ducis tecum. The Department of Water Resources clearly recognized that it was in connection with me because they filed a response in their response to my August 1st filing, and they also provided a response. I sent
So
a
again,
letter,
Ms. Dejan,
and they
Ms.
provided a
Dejan,
response for the
enough.
record about response to those documents.
And so
And you
I'm at a loss because if your request has been responded to, you may disagree with what information was provided, but that does not mean that we have to continue to play out these requests if the department has already responded.
The department's response was evasive, incomplete, and the statement that they had provided all documents responsive to the subpoena
That is a
was simply
disagreement.
incorrect.
That is a disagreement between you and the department. It is not a matter for us.
I did. So it's not simply a matter of disagreement. It is.
It is not a matter before us.
To the extent that you stated that you would take it under consideration.
I have taken under consideration, and I have now decided it is not a matter before us. You may disagree with me as well, but that is the ruling.
Why is it not before you?
Because your PRA request is a matter
It's a
with the
subpoena.
department.
I did file an affidavit of concealment. Part of what was concealed by this false statement was the ex parte correspondence and documents shared with the Water Board which have not been produced for this subpoena.
That's a separate motion that you have filed with us.
No, this is concealed from discovery by this subpoena. It's not separate from this motion. And the statement that all documents have produced was simply false.
Fine.
Thank you.
It's on the record. You said so.
All right.
Ms. Morris, do you have a subpoena that we need to follow up on as well?
No, I have a teeny tiny housekeeping matter. Stephanie Morris for the State Water Contractors. I was hoping that the hearing team could remind everybody about the service list because there seems to be some discrepancies between what people are getting. And I understand that some people have email limitations and they're coming in 2 different batches, but I don't think that I'm getting everything on the service list. And since everything that's served on the service list is not also posted somewhere, which is fine, it's just really important that people are using the most up-to-date service list and making sure that it's getting to everybody. That's all. Thank you.
Have your contact information changed? Because you have always been on the service list, so regardless how it's been updated, you should still be on the old one.
I understand, but I am not getting everything. And I've checked with other attorneys, and they've gotten things that I haven't gotten, which they forward, and I've gotten things they haven't gotten. So it seems to me that we just all need to make sure we are using the most current list and that everything is going through.
All right? Has everyone noticed that? All right. Are there any other housekeeping matters? I see Mr. Becerra in the audience. Let me confirm, Group 7 is still switching places with Group 42 for cross-examination of Panel 2? 45, sorry. Yes? Okay, all right. I have to learn to look this way. Mr. Mizell, I think we are ready to get to your next witness.
Thank you very much. Today we are joined by Dr. Ohlendorf. He has not taken the oath yet.
Please stand and raise your right hand. I should remember Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer, yes, I do. Thank you.
Thank you. So today we'll be hearing from Mr. Aaron Miller and Dr. Harry Ohlendorf. And that will conclude our summaries of our written testimony, at which point we can go into cross-examination at your convenience. I have one question, or 2 questions for Dr. Ohlendorf before we begin. Dr. Ohlendorf, is DWR 1004 a true and correct copy of your statement of qualifications?
Yes.
And is DWR 1019 a true and correct copy of your testimony?
Yes.
Thank you very much. We'll now be turning it over to Mr. Miller. Before he begins his oral summary, though, I believe there are a couple of citation corrections we'd like to make for the record. Mr. Miller.
Yes. Can we bring up Exhibit 1011? And so the first correction I'd like to make is on page 7. And line 27. So exhibit SWRCB 84 should be SWRCB 102, and that should be reflective of the final FEIR. Reflective of the 2017 certified FEIR. I'm sorry. The second correction I'd like to make is on page 9 and line 19. Exhibit SWRCB 104. This is the one of the original BAs. It should be the updated BA, which would be Exhibit DWR 1142. The third correction is on page 10, line 10. And so the two of my exhibits got switched, and so the exhibit 1033 should be DWR 1034. Again, on page 10, line 24 and 25, SWRCB 27, table 3, footnote 9, should read footnote 10. And then finally on page 12, line 14, this is the other exhibit that got switched. So this exhibit should be, instead of DWR 1034, it should be DWR 1033. And that concludes my corrections.
And Mr. Miller, before you begin, the substance of your testimony has not changed, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you very much. Mr. Miller, please summarize your written testimony for the hearing officers.
I don't think you mean Mr. Miller, or do you?
Yeah.
Mr. Miller.
Sorry.
Yeah, we'll begin with Mr. Miller with the operations,
Got it.
and we'll move to Dr. Ohlendorf after he is done.
Well, good morning. Can we bring up DWR 1025? My name is Aaron Miller, and I'm a supervising water resources engineer specialist with the Department of Water Resources. And I work in the Water Operations Office. This is the office that manages the water for the State Water Project. I've worked in this office now for a little over 11 years and have had a number of responsibilities, including scheduling exports and releases for real-time water operations management and evaluating State Water Project operations with models like CalSim. I have about 7 years of prior experience working with other modeling, primarily hydrodynamic and water quality modeling in the Delta. And so, as an operator and a modeler, I have a unique perspective. I understand operations, and I understand modeling, and I understand how modeling relates to real-world operations. So the purpose of my testimony today is to highlight how the State Water Project is managed in real-time operations. Next slide, please. So in part one of this hearing, Mr. Lehi talked about how the project is managed by people and not by models. And these people are operators with input from biologists, and these folks are making decisions based on actual conditions. And then the model is simulating the aggregate of those decisions. So in the first part of my testimony today, I'm going to talk about how the State Water Project is managed using real-time operations to meet the regulatory requirements. In the second part of my testimony today, I'm going to talk about operationalization of criteria. And the modeling that supported the California Waterfix petition included new criteria for the H3 plus scenario. But these criteria need to be operationalized before they could be really implemented in real-time operations. And when I talk about operationalizing, I'm talking about taking an objective and then developing a way to implement the intent of that objective in daily operations. And so in the second part of my testimony, I'm going to describe how the California Waterfix H3 Plus criteria could be operationalized, and then give some examples of how those criteria could have been implemented in 2016. So the next slide, please. So real-time operations is essentially a process of making decisions based on observed data. And it can really be broken into two components, where the first component is the day-to-day operational decisions that are being made to operate the state water project to changing hydrologic conditions. And then the second component is this interagency coordination, where reclamation and DWR are incorporating input from the fishery agencies on operations that are protective of listed species. I do want to note here that real-time operations are different than the adaptive management program. Real-time operations are how the state water project is managed to meet criteria, whereas the adaptive management program is a process of evaluating and potentially modifying that criteria. Next slide, please. So the first component of real-time operations is the day-to-day operational decisions, where the operators are looking ahead and scheduling exports and releases in order to meet the upcoming regulatory requirements. And as most people are aware, we have a very complex system where we have a time delay from making a reservoir release change to seeing that change in the delta. And then we have depletions and tidal energy that can change very rapidly. And we have a number of tools to help us inform our decisions, but even with these tools, operators do not have perfect foresight, and changes are often required. And those changes are often informed by monitoring of the conditions. And then those changes are rolled back into new forecasts and future plans. And it's through this operational planning and real-time adjustment that the state water project has managed to meet these regulatory obligations. Next slide, please. The second component of real-time operations is where reclamation and DWR are incorporating input from the fishery agencies, who are making determinations based on actual conditions. This coordination happens through the Water Operations Management Team, or WOMPT. And this team is a management level team that facilitates decisions on operations and fishery protection. It's a team that's made up of representatives from Reclamation, DWR, National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and it's also monitored by the State Water Board and sometimes the EPA. The team relies heavily on input from working groups. So I have here listed two of the main groups working primarily in the Delta. And each of these groups assess their respective listed species, the conditions in the Delta, the planned project operations, and then they provide this assessment back to WOMPT for final decision making. And so in summary, these two components of real-time operations both rely very heavily on actual data to make those decisions. Next slide, please. My hydraulics are weak. So now I want to move on to the operationalization of the California Waterfix H3 Plus, and how. So I want to describe how these criteria can be operationalized and implemented. And so I have three of the main criteria here, and all three of these are delta specific and ultimately limit the diversions for fishery protection. Where the pulse protection operations limit the northern diversion, the old and middle river flow objectives limit the southern diversion, and the spring outflow target limits both the northern and the southern diversion. So in the next series of slides, I'm going to describe how each of these could be operationalized and implemented, and show you an example of how those could have been implemented in 2016. Within these slides, I'm going to show three plots. On each one of these plots, you'll have the same historical conditions and the same California Waterfix conceptual operation that applies these criteria. The only difference will be that I'm going to highlight where these individual criteria would have been applied. And so next slide, please. Before going on to the first example, which is specific to the North Delta, I want to highlight that there's going to be a number of considerations that go into scheduling the diversions of the North Delta. And the modeling assumed various forms of assumptions on these. But I want to focus in on the last bullet, or dash, the monitoring for and reacting to fish presence. The model is not able to simulate actual fish presence, so it used a flow surrogate at Wilkins Slough instead. Whereas in real-time operations, we'll have the ability to monitor for and react to this fish presence. And this could be used in the pulse protection, fish pulse protection actions. So let's look at our first example. Next slide. So the purpose of the fish pulse protection actions is to limit the northern diversions during salmon outmigration events. The NIMS biological opinion used the Knight's Landing Catch Index in their effects analysis. This is an index that is based on actual fish presence in the Sacramento River at Knight's Landing. And consistent with the opinion, I use the Knight's Landing Catch Index in my analysis as well. So when the Knight's Landing Catch Index indicates 5 or more fish, then the northern diversions would be limited to 900 CFS. And this low-level pumping would continue until the Knight's Landing Catch Index indicated less than 5 fish for 5 consecutive days, or until the Sacramento flows, the bypass flows on Sacramento exceeded 35,000 CFS. So this is 35,000 CFS passing the last intake. And so on the next slide, this is a demonstration of how those actual fish pulse protection actions would have been implemented in 2016. Oh, Mr. Hunt, can we keep it zoomed out for a moment? Thank you, sir.
Before you get teased by everyone like Mr. Becerra was on Friday, this is Mr. Baker.
Oh,
Really? My apologies. I'm impressed.
Thank you. Yeah, I
Hold
did.
on a second. Ho- Thank you. Let us take a break while we address this technical challenge. Hold on a second, Mr. Miller. Hopefully it's just a second. All right, if everyone could please take your seats. My understanding is that our setup is working fine and that some people are hearing the webcasts all right. So it might be a matter of individual setting on the various devices that people are using to access the webcast. Oh, nope. Not the case, Mr. Becerra?
Ryan Becerra. My observation has generally been that the webcast works much better on a Microsoft browser than on any other browser. And so maybe that's part of the issue.
Oh. Apple discrimination again. What we'll do is we will continue. We also have one of our staff monitoring the website. Is the staff using an Apple Safari browser or a Microsoft? Microsoft, okay. All right, we will proceed. Mr. Miller.
Okay, so this slide is demonstrating the demonstrating the pulse protection actions that would have occurred in 2016 based on the historic fish catch at Knight's Landing. But before I get into the details of those actions, I want to orient you to this graph. And so we are looking at water year 2016, and where the x-axis is time and the y-axis is flow. And on here I have the actual historic data from 2016. Those are shown in the solid lines, where the red solid line is showing the historic exports out of the south of Delta. So this would be Clifton Court and Jones Pumping Plant. And then the blue solid line is showing the resulting outflow from 2016. So I took this historic data and then applied the California Waterfix H3 Plus criteria to come up with a conceptual operation, and that is shown in the dotted lines, where the red dotted line is showing the total diversions from the north and the south of Delta, and then the blue dotted line is showing the resulting outflow from that operation. I also have on here a dashed blue line that is showing the outflow required to roughly meet the D1641 Fish and Wildlife and Western Delta standards. And as you can see, both the historic and the California Waterfix operation meet that criteria. And then the green shaded areas are showing where historic fish presence at Knight's Landing catch index would have indicated fish pulse protection actions. And so, Mr. Hunt, if we could now zoom into that second pulse. I want to focus in on the second pulse for efficiency, and also so we can see the full implementation of this action. Can we zoom in a little bit more? And then scroll over and show the axes. I just want to look at the second pulse there. Yes. And maybe down a little bit. So we're focusing in on the second shaded green area. And this fish pulse occurred right at the beginning of a high runoff event, just there in the beginning of January. And the Knight's Landing catch index at the beginning of that first or second shaded area indicated 5 or more fish at Knight's Landing. And so the northern diversions were limited to 900 CFS. And we can see that by looking at the dotted red line. It is just a little bit above the solid red line. And this is indicating that the north of Delta is diverting additional water, but is limited to that 900 CFS. And this continues for the most of that second shaded area until we get to near the end of that, where the bypass flows on the Sacramento begin to exceed 35,000 CFS. And so at that point, the northern diversions are able to increase above 900 CFS while still maintaining bypass flows of 35,000 CFS on the pass of the intakes. And so this demonstrates how actual fish presence could indicate fish pulse protection actions. So can we go on to the next slide? So the next criteria I want to discuss is the Old and Middle River flow criteria. this is a something that we operate to currently under current operations, and it's a measure of it's an upstream restriction on Old and Middle River between the Central Delta and the southern exports. And this was introduced with the 2008-2009 Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS biological opinions. And it ranges between negative 1250 and negative 5,000, and it's typically in place between January and June. And so it's a negative flow because it's a limitation on the upstream flow towards the exports. And so this criteria is primarily met by adjusting the southern diversions. So the California Waterfix 83 Plus proposes additional OMAR criteria in December during the same fish pulse protection action I just spoke of, and then again in April and May, but with those OMARs being dependent on the flow in the San Joaquin River. And so operating to this new criteria would be just like we do today, where we look at whatever criteria is most restrictive and then operate to that most restrictive criteria. Next slide, please. So this slide is, again, has the same information as the previous slide, except I'm just highlighting here where those OMAR criteria would have been applied. So the first small shaded area is the same period that the pulse protection actions in December occurred, and then the second shaded area is just showing the extent of the April-May period where additional OMAR criteria would have been applied. So in part one of this hearing, Mr. Lehigh had talked about how the California Waterfix would add additional flexibility in meeting regulatory requirements. And OMR would be one of those criteria. So for example, during health and safety pumping, so this criteria makes the southern this criteria makes the OMR more restrictive, and then the California Waterfix helps in meeting that criteria because you can shift some of those exports that would have been taken at the south of Delta and you can shift them to the north of Delta. And this is important during health and safety pumping. For example, in 2016, the April-May period was primarily being restricted by the spring outflow target, which I'll talk about next. But at the end of May, this new criteria would have restricted the southern exports even further. But because that flow could be shifted to the north of Delta, health and safety pumping could be maintained. Does that make sense? I know I kind of.
So why is that not reflected, or is it reflected in this chart?
It is reflected in the chart, but it's in behind the chart. I don't have it explicitly laid out there. All right, so that demonstrates where and how the OMR criteria could have been operationalized and implemented in 2016. Can we move on to the next slide? So the final criteria I want to discuss is the spring outflow target. And so the purpose of the spring outflow target is to maintain the 3-month average outflow March to May, as observed under existing conditions with the existing regulatory requirements and the existing infrastructure. And the intent of this target can be operated to by determining a monthly target and then operating to that target through the exports down to as low as 1500 CFS. The monthly target in March can be determined using a 8-river index. And the 8-river index is essentially a hydrologic indicator of conditions in the Central Valley. And then in April and May, the target can be determined using the San Joaquin inflow to export ratio. And this is a criteria that was described in the 2009 NIMS biological opinion. And it's something that we operate currently too. And under that criteria, we reduce exports down to 1500 CFS. But under the spring outflow target, that constraint would be lifted if outflows exceeded that 44,500 CFS. Next slide, please. So this slide demonstrates the spring outflow target. And again, it's the same slide as before, but I'm just highlighting in the shaded blue area the extent of that that criteria, and here the top of the shaded area is indicating the calculated outflow target. So Mr. Hunt, can we zoom in to the March while also showing the axes? So as we, in 2016, as we enter into March, we determine a target based on the 8-river index, forecasted 8-river index, to be 19,000 CFS. And so in March, the top of the shaded blue area is indicating that 19,000 CFS target. However, as you can see, that the first week or so, the outflows were lower than that target. And so the total diversions under the California Waterfix conceptual operation, as shown in the dotted red line, is dropped to 1500 CFS in an effort to increase outflows to that target. And so you can see the dotted blue line then increases a bit in response to that reduction. However, it's not until the outflows exceed 19,000 CFS that the total diversions are increased above the 1500 CFS level. And then as we transition into April and May, in this case we are changing the way we're calculating the target, and we're now using the San Joaquin inflow to export ratio. This is essentially how we operated actually in 2016, and so the results are very much similar. And so that is an example of how the spring outflow target could have been implemented in 2016. And can we move on to the next slide? So I know we went through a bunch of stuff fairly quickly, but I think that the important thing to take away from my testimony is that the California Waterfix proposes additional criteria. And as I have shown in my examples here, that criteria can be operationalized and implemented in real-time operations. And that concludes my summary testimony. And now I believe I'll turn it over to Dr. Ohlendorf.
Thank you, Mr. Miller, and good morning, hearing officers. I'll be briefly summarizing my testimony that describes the development and calibration of selenium bioaccumulation models that we used or developed for the evaluation in the final EIR, EIS, and the biological assessment for evaluating conditions under Alternative 4A operational scenario H3 plus in comparison to existing conditions and the no action alternative.
Excuse me, Dr. Ollendorf, if I might interrupt you for a sec. Mr. Hunt, could we bring up DWR 1067, please? Thank you.
Thanks. This modeling work that we did is one of many selenium-related projects that I've led since discovering the effects of selenium on birds at Kesterson Reservoir back in 1980s. And overall, selenium has been a large part of my work since Kesterson Reservoir. And overall, I've had over 45 years of evaluating effects of environmental contaminants on fish and wildlife, but selenium has been a large part of that over the recent years. Could you bring up the next slide, please? My presentation will begin with a short summary. I'll be describing reasons for having high credibility in the models. I'll talk some about selenium basics because selenium is quite different from most water quality constituents that are of concern. And I'll describe the delta-wide model that we developed and calibrated for fish such as largemouth bass that eat other fish. So that would be also similar to striped bass or fish like that. And the separate modeling that we did for the Western Delta, focusing on sturgeon. And I'll describe the selenium model outputs and then summarize with some conclusions. Next slide, please. The calibrated models that we developed covered the range of expected water concentrations of selenium in the Delta, including the higher concentrations from the San Joaquin River and lower from sources such as the Sacramento River. And the calibrated models gave reasonable predictions of the concentrations of selenium that would be found in fish based on the concentration found in the water. I'll be talking about a couple of terms often throughout the presentation. One of these is enrichment functions. The EF, or enrichment function, describes the uptake of selenium from water into the lowest level of the food chain, such as suspended particulates in the water column or algae that then are consumed by invertebrates. And from one level to the next in the food chain, we refer to as a trophic transfer factor that we'll be talking about shortly. But the higher enrichment factors that we found with lower waterborne selenium concentrations are consistent with what's in the literature, and I'll be showing that. Development of this model, including the site-specific enrichment factors, was essential toward modeling the potential future conditions in the Delta. Next slide, please. A couple of reasons we have high credibility in the models, or the models have high credibility. One is related to the modeling approach itself, and the other is the observational data that we had available for calibration. Talking about the model itself, we followed the approach developed by Presser and Loma, who are considered to be authorities in the field of selenium bioaccumulation modeling. They have a series of publications that we relied on in the approach. Again, the higher enrichment factors that we found in our modeling are consistent with expectations from literature. And the modeling approach that we used also was used in the subsequently promulgated water quality criterion for selenium by EPA. We had largemouth bass data for 3 years from 9 locations in the Delta. Those were collected in 2000, 2005, and 2007. And we had then a range of wetter years in 2000, 2005, and the dry year 2007 that helped in calibration of the model. Next slide, please. In Selenium Basics, it's very important that we recognize that site-specific chemical, biological, and physical conditions determine how selenium bioaccumulates in the food web. Excuse me. So we had the measured selenium concentrations in largemouth bass provided by the Regional Water Board from 2000, 2005, and 2007. One of the notable facts was that the selenium concentrations in largemouth bass from the mouth of the Sacramento River were not significantly different from those near the mouth of the San Joaquin, even though the waterborne selenium concentrations from the Sacramento River are substantially lower than those from the San Joaquin. And again, these terms, enrichment factor, or EF, going from water to particulates, rather than the trophic transfer factor going from one level of the food chain to the next, are the ones that are most variable. The enrichment factors are much more variable than those going from one trophic level to the next. Next slide, please. This figure is from one of the chapters of a book that we produced. We held a week-long workshop in Pensacola, Florida, sponsored by the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. We brought together 46 people from around the world who had expertise in selenium. These were representative from government, academia, and industry, as well as NGOs and students, and the purpose was to develop a consensus of understanding of how selenium behaves in the aquatic environment and the assessment of the effects of selenium on fish and wildlife. So on the x-axis here, we're looking at not much of a cursor there, but I'm trying to point out that selenium concentration is increasing on the y-axis here on the left side. So selenium concentration, oh, it disappears in the figure. So on the y-axis, selenium concentration is increasing. Across the lower axis, we have the different environmental compartments. The enrichment factor here, again, is the most highly variable factor in uptake of selenium, going from water through the food chain to fish. Going from water to the lowest level in the food chain, such as algae, typically the magnification is orders of magnitude, so we're going from parts per billion to parts per million concentration. So typically hundreds or thousands fold increase going from water to particulates or algae. Once the selenium is in the food, like the algae, the transfer going from algae to invertebrates is much lower, typically less than a factor of 5. So the trophic transfer factor going from algae to invertebrates, again, typically less than 5, and even a smaller factor going from invertebrates to fish. Next slide, please. So talking about the delta-wide selenium bioaccumulation model, we considered 5 different models. We began by using some literature available default enrichment factors and trophic transfer factors. And second model, we used some delta-specific enrichment factors and the literature-derived trophic transfer factors. Both of those significantly underestimated the concentrations of selenium in the largemouth bass that we had from the 9 locations where we could calibrate the model. So we looked at different approaches for deriving the enrichment factors and calibrating the model that best fit the uptake from water to fish, to the largemouth bass, and then using the fish data and the modeled water data and the trophic transfer factors, the big variable again being the enrichment factor. We solved for that by back calculating, and we derived enrichment factors that allowed us to calibrate the model. These enrichment factors varied between wetter years, 2000 and 2005, where our enrichment factor median was a couple thousand. And in the dry year, 2007, our median enrichment factor was 3 times higher. So the uptake was much greater in 2007 than in 2000, 2005. And it also it varied by location. So the enrichment factor for the Sacramento River was 4,900 in comparison to 600 at the mouth of the San Joaquin. Again, the key point was that the largemouth bass data did not have significantly different concentrations of selenium at the mouths of the 2 rivers, and the difference or the explanation is that enrichment factor. And by solving for the enrichment factor, we were able to calibrate our models. Next slide, please. This figure shows the negative relationship between the enrichment factor, or here it's called KD. The 2 terms are used interchangeably. On the left axis, we have the KD going from 100 up to 10,000, and across the bottom we have the water concentration from near the mouth of the Sacramento and similar sources to near 1 microgram per liter at the mouth of the San Joaquin. So we see that significant negative relationship between the enrichment factor and the waterborne concentration. So this is using 88 data points that we had for location and sample-specific fish and water data. And it describes conditions when we have all 3 years combined. Next slide, please. So we looked then at the wetter years, 2000, 2005, and we have this relationship here. Again, the same general trend, but somewhat lower than the overall picture. And next slide, please. We'll see the enrichment factor is much higher. And again, that relates to the difference in selenium accumulation in the wetter years versus the drier 2007. Next slide, please. For the Western Delta, we did separate modeling because there are different dietary exposures for the sturgeon than there were for the largemouth bass that we used in developing and calibrating the Delta-wide model. So we looked at the two Western Delta locations. And here we were able to use literature-derived values that were recently provided by Presser and Looma for sturgeon, specifically in the Carquinez Sassoon Bay area. So in our modeling, we used all of the input parameters there, the enrichment functions, the trophic transfer functions, and estimated uptake of selenium from the water to the diet and then to the sturgeon. Next slide, please. So in terms of outputs, again, now we're talking here about the Delta-wide model. Outputs included estimation of, first, the selenium concentrations in particulates and algae that form the basis of the food chain, and then from those particulates into invertebrates, and from invertebrates into fish, and also into bird eggs. We did that for both the insect-eating birds such as waterfowl and shorebirds, and for fish-eating birds. Next slide. Calibrated models 3, 4, and 5 that I'll be showing shortly gave reasonable predictions of the concentrations of selenium in whole body fish. And modeling of sturgeon, as I mentioned, was based on literature-derived values and did not require calibration. Next slide. So in this slide, we see the results of the 5 Delta-wide models. Again, the first 2 models on the left are well below our target. Here we're looking, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but there's a line here for 1. We're looking for a ratio of 1 of the predicted selenium concentration in fish compared to the measured concentrations. So we want a ratio of 1. The first 2 models substantially underestimated the selenium concentration, whereas models 3, 4, and 5 gave reasonable predictions. Model 3, again, was for all 3 years of data. Model 4 was for the wetter years, 2000 and 2005. And Model 5 on the right was the one for the dry year, 2007. Next slide. So conclusions, the calibrated models, which cover the range of predicted selenium concentrations in water in the Delta under future conditions, gave reasonable predictions of selenium concentrations in whole body fish. And the higher enrichment factors that we calculated are consistent with what's been found in the literature, and also as EPA found in the development of the water quality criterion for selenium in 2016. And developing these site-specific enrichment factors was critical to being able to model uptake of selenium from the water to fish under future conditions. That concludes my summary. Thank you.
So that wraps up the oral summaries for panel 2. At this point, these witnesses are available for cross-examination. If it would be convenient for the hearing officers, we can bring different witnesses to the front or let them stay seated where they are.
I think they may be seated as long as they identify themselves with a court reporter. That would be appropriate. We'll take a break at some point, but before we do, can I get a showing from the parties who wish to conduct cross-examination of this panel and an estimate of time? I believe Ms. Morris has already said she has just very few questions, but I would like to hear from the other parties as well. Please, if you could, identify yourself by group number and a time estimate.
Good morning, Daniel O'Hanlon on behalf of the San Luis Delta Minota Water Authority, which is Group 4. My time estimate is 15, maybe 20 minutes.
Good morning, Meredith Nickel on behalf of North Delta Water Agency Group Number 9. I have approximately 1 hour.
John Herrick, South Delta Parties, 45 minutes to an hour. Group 21.
Thank you.
Good morning, John Salmon on behalf of East Bay Municipal Utility District. Fred Etheridge is here as well today. Pardon me. We estimate approximately 2 hours for this panel.
Group number
15.
15, thank you.
Ryan Becerra for cities of Folsom and Roseville, Sacramento Suburban Water District, and San Juan Water District, Group 7. I'd estimate 3 to 4 hours.
A reminder, Mr. Becerra, since you're not used to going so far back in the order, that don't repeat.
I'm quite aware of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael Jackson on behalf of Group 31. I'm going to be assisted in cross by Chris Schutz. Together, we assume it would be around 3 hours.
Good morning, Kelly Tabor on behalf of the Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District, Group 13, and City of Stockton, Group 22. I expect a total of 10 minutes for both groups.
Thank you, Ms. Tabor.
Suzanne Womack, Clifton Court LP, Group 43. I expect at least an hour. Thank you.
Curtis Keller with Contra Costa County. We're in Group 25. Dan Wolk from Solano County is also here today. We have questions, probably 30 to 45 minutes. If possible, we'd also request to switch our Group 25 with Group 19, which is Miss Meserve's group from land.
And coincidentally or not, she's next.
Good morning, Ocean Meserve for land and other parties. I estimate 2 hours of cross for this panel.
Deirdre Desjardins, Group 37. I estimate 2 hours. Tom Stokely, who's been designated a lay representative for PCFFA, will have 2 hours for that group. I don't believe he's here today.
Do you happen to know his group number?
38.
Thank you. Okay.
Good morning, Ellen Weir on behalf of Grassland Water District. We expect approximately 40 minutes for cross-exam.
And your group number?
44.
44.
Good morning, Doug Obigi on behalf of NRDC et al. With the hearing officer's indulgence, we would expect 2 to 4 hours, depending upon what questions have already been asked and how quickly we can move through the questions.
Group number?
35.
Thank you.
Tom Keeling on behalf of the San Joaquin County Protestants, Group 24. We estimate about 20 minutes for this panel.
And Ms. Nickel is back.
Meredith Nickel on behalf of the Sacramento Valley Group, part of Group 7. I also anticipate an additional hour for Group 7 and Andy Hitchings, and I will be coordinating that portion of the cross for Group 7, keeping in mind to be as efficient as possible.
Thank you. Group 2, panel 2, you will be here quite a while, as you can tell from that. Ms. Morris, can you conduct your cross-examination in 10 minutes? Let's do that, then we'll take a break. Yes, please.
Good morning, Stephanie Morris for State Water Contractors. I just have a few questions for Ms. White. Ms. White, your expertise in this hearing is in CVP, SWP operations and modeling, correct?
And this is Ms. White. Ms. White, if you would like to stand up at the podium there.
We'll figure that out.
Yes.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that in the
Sure. Your
microphone?
expertise for this hearing is in CVP, SWP operations and modeling, correct?
That's correct.
And do you have a degree in biology?
No, I do not.
And have you ever worked for National Marine Fishery Services?
No, I have not.
Have you ever worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services?
No, I have not.
Have you ever worked for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife?
No, I have not.
Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morris. With that, we will then take our break, and we will return at 11:05.
Yeah, and then you hold it again to turn it off.
think it, so it could have been better. Things I didn't say, but
I think it was clear. I could see a lot of head nodding up there.
Alicia was responsive. I didn't see as much.
Yeah, that was obviously his high estimate. His bookend sort of went like that.
They say there's not gonna be the one that breaks into town. It's always nice to get that out of the way.
Yeah. All these stops and starts and everything.
I know, this is why I said, should I just get up and do some work? And I turned on, Southern Application.
There's still stuff.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We will now turn to group number 4 for your cross-examination. And if you could begin by identifying the issues that you'll be exploring.
Thank you, Hearing Officer Dodek. My name is Daniel O'Hanlon, appearing on behalf of the San Luis and Delta Medulla Water Authority. This morning, I'll be asking questions of Dr. Greenwood regarding scientific uncertainties underlying some of the operating criteria that are intended to protect fish and how that uncertainty supports the need for adaptive management. Good morning, Dr. Greenwood.
Good morning.
You have testified that, in your opinion, the proposed operating criteria in California Waterfix H3+ are reasonably protective of fish, correct?
Yes, I have.
And your opinion is based, at least in part, on the fact that the operating criteria include implementation of requirements imposed under the 2008 and 2009 biological opinions regarding the effects of existing coordinated operations of the Central Valley Project and State Water Project on the Delta smelt and various salmonid species, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And your opinion is also based on the requirements that will be implemented under the biological opinions recently issued for the California Waterfix project, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. And you also rely for your opinion on the terms of the incidental take permit issued by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for the Waterfix project, correct?
That's correct.
Now, the criteria in the biological opinions and in the incidental take permit are based on what the wildlife agencies believed would be protective for fish, correct?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
All right, so as an example, the limits on negative OMR flows, which we've already heard a little bit about this morning, are intended to reduce the risk of entrainment at the project export pumps, correct?
Yes.
All right, but scientific research regarding how to protect fish in the Delta and the factors affecting their abundance is still ongoing, correct?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
And it's expected that the California Waterfix won't begin operations for at least 10 years, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Now, I'd like to ask you about some specific areas of uncertainty in the science that underlines some of the recommended management measures for the protection of fish. Could I please have Dr. Greenwood's written testimony, which is Exhibit DWR 1012. And I'd like to please turn to page 23, line 19. Thank you. And I'm going to read the sentence that begins on page 19 and goes on to page 24, line 2. Low salinity zone habitat, I'm getting the quote, low salinity zone habitat is believed to provide, along with other factors, suitable rearing conditions for early life stages. However, direct links between the extent of low salinity zone habitat, /X2 and Delta smelt population responses are unclear, and this is an active area of research, close quote. First, what are the other factors needed for suitable rearing conditions for early life stages of Delta smelt?
I'm sorry, can we look at the whole sentence again?
Sure. In your testimony, you indicate that low salinity zone habitat, along with other factors, provide suitable rearing conditions for early life stages. And so my question is, what other factors, in addition to low salinity zone habitat, are needed for rearing conditions for Delta smelt?
I can give a couple of examples. So the reference here to low salinity zone habitat, I think what I'm meaning there is the extent of the area of habitat that has low salinity, which for Delta smelt is represented by about 1 to 6 parts per thousand. And then these other factors would be factors within the low salinity zone, such as relatively high turbidity, relatively high food, zooplankton in particular. So those are a couple of examples. The sources that I cite there, I think, have possibly some additional examples, but those are a couple of examples of the sorts of things.
Okay, thank you. And what do you mean in your statement that direct links between the extent of low salinity zone habitat X2 and delta smelt population responses are unclear? What did you mean by that statement?
Some analyses have shown, I think some analyses have shown potential linkage and other analyses have not, and therefore it's not completely clear that there's a linkage there between the extent of low salinity zone habitat and the population response.
Okay. And the fact that the linkage is unclear, is that a reason to build adaptive management into the California Waterfix project?
Yes.
I'd like to turn to page 25, please, of DWR Exhibit 1012, lines 1 to 5. And I'll read that statement. Quote, there is a positive correlation between longfin smelt abundance, parens, fall midwater trawl index, close parens, and average X2 from January through June. The 2016 FEIR/S assumes that the mechanisms underlying this correlation are related to spawning, egg incubation, and rearing habitat. The actual mechanisms underlying the observed correlation are uncertain, close quote. And could you please explain what you meant by this statement?
Which particular statement? The whole, what you just read, or
that the actual, I'm sorry, that the actual mechanisms underlying the observed correlation are uncertain.
The fact that the mechanisms explaining this correlation are not known, they're uncertain. As the sentence says, I'm not sure what additional clarification you would want regarding that.
Well,
I don't believe that it's known what the mechanism underlying that correlation is. So I consider that to be uncertain.
Okay, so if I can perhaps restate it, there is this correlation between abundance and the average X2, but is it the case that why that exactly occurs is not known?
Yes.
All right, and a little further down in your testimony, lines 19 to 22, you cite that uncertainty as a reason for addressing spring outflow through adaptive management, correct?
Correct.
All right. I'd like to call up another exhibit. This one is State Water Resources Control Board Exhibit 50. All right, and this is I'll read the title, Fishes and Flows in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, Research Needs and Support of Adaptive Management. Have you seen this report before?
I believe I've seen it. I don't recall the specifics of the report.
Okay. Could we please have page 3 of the report? All right, could you scroll up just a little bit? I want to see, I want to refer to a paragraph at the bottom of the page there. Yes, that's great, thanks. There's a statement there under the heading, Delta as an evolving place. And I'll read it to you, then I'm going to ask you a question about it. The Delta ecosystem has experienced considerable changes and is still evolving. The current Delta and its tributaries bear little resemblance to the pre-development Delta in terms of its water flow, regime, habitat structure, and fish communities. And can I please have the top of page 3 now, please? and differ starkly from the conditions under which the delta's native fish evolved. Non-native fishes now predominate, and the habitat and flow needs of the native species are difficult to define in the transformed place and in a novel ecosystem. Do you agree with the statements in this paragraph?
I would have to consider them more to really definitively give you an answer.
All right, that's fine. Do you agree that changes have occurred in the delta over time?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And how would the fact that the delta is an evolving place and has changed over time, how would that complicate efforts to come up with the management measures protective of native fish?
I would have to consider that in more detail. Can't really give you an answer at the moment.
All right. This paragraph characterizes the delta as a novel ecosystem. Do you agree with that characterization?
I've heard that characterization, and I understand the basis for it. So, possibly. I mean, yes, I could see how it could be described that way.
All right. Is the delta a combination of native and non-native species currently, correct?
Yes.
All right. And do non-native species predominate in the delta?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
Do you have an estimate of the relative, say, biomass of non-native versus native species in the delta?
I believe there are estimates. I don't have one to hand.
Okay, something over 90%. Does that sound familiar to you?
Objection, calls for speculation.
Sustain.
All right. How would the fact that the delta has a combination now of native and non-native species that didn't co-evolve, how would that complicate efforts to develop management measures for the protection of fish?
I would have to consider that more. I think there's a fair bit that could be spoken to regarding that topic, and I'm not sure I'm prepared to speculate on it this morning.
All right. Could I please have page 6 of the report? I'd like to, again, read you a statement. This one under the heading towards the bottom of the page. The heading is Multiple Drivers Affect Fishes. Flow is but one factor affecting fishes, and its effects are confounded by other drivers of fish production in the ecosystem. 5 major drivers are considered as agents of change in any given ecosystem. These are habitat alteration and loss, resource use and exploitation, invasive species, pollution, and climate. All of these drivers have played a role in the delta and affected fishes. And do you agree with that statement?
I think that's a reasonable summary, I guess. So I think I would agree, but again, I would have to think more on the specifics.
All right. Thank you. Could I have exhibit State Water Resources Control Board 54? And could I have the second page, please? The next page. Thank you. This is a report titled A Scientific Assessment of Alternatives for Reducing Water Management Effects on Threatened and Endangered Fishes in California's Bay Delta. This is a report prepared on behalf of the National Academy of Sciences. Have you seen this report before?
Yes.
And does this report analyze, among other things, analyze the reasonable and prudent alternatives in the 2008 and 2009 biological opinions?
I believe so, yeah.
Could I please have page 51 of this exhibit? Thank you. There's a paragraph that begins in the first full paragraph on that page. I want to read to you, and I'm going to ask you a question about it. The biological benefits and the water requirements of this action, and this action that's being referred to is limits on OMR flows for the protection of delta smelt. The water requirements of this action are likely to be sensitive to the precise values of trigger and threshold values. There clearly is a relationship between OMR flows and salvage rates, but the available data do not permit a confident identification of the threshold values to use in the action, and they do not permit a confident assessment of the benefits to the population of the action. As a result, the implementation of this action needs to be accompanied by careful monitoring, adaptive management, and additional analyses. Now, as I understand it, they were saying here that there's a basis for limiting negative OMR flows to reduce entrainment risk. But exactly where to set the limits on OMR flows and how much benefit those limits provide the delta smelt population is not clear. Is that how you understand their statement?
Yes.
And do you agree with it?
I would note that this report's from, I think, 2010. So at the time, that statement was reasonable, and I think in the interim years, there's been more learned on this issue, and so to some extent, I think that statement still applies, but there has been more knowledge gained on how to manage old and middle river flows, as well as additional analyses relating to what the population level effects are, for example, with a delta smelt life cycle model. So I think the time frame of when the report was issued, where we are now, is important to consider.
Thank you. Do you agree with the statement in that paragraph that implementation of the OMR flow measure should be accompanied by adaptive management?
Yes.
All right, there's one more exhibit I'd like to ask you about, and this is exhibit San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority 20. All right, this is a report titled Effects of Water Project Operations on Juvenile Salmonid Migration and Survival in the South Delta. Volume 1, Findings and Recommendations. Have you seen this report before?
Yes.
Okay. And are you generally familiar with its contents?
I haven't read it completely, so I'm familiar with the general themes, yes.
Do you know what the Collaborative Adaptive Management Team is?
Yes.
What is it?
It's an adaptive management team, as I understand it, that is informing the adaptive management process for the implementation of the 2008-2009 biological opinions and additional considerations that I believe arose from various legal actions associated with that, with those biological opinions.
Okay. And is it your understanding that the salmonid scoping team was tasked by the Collaborative Adaptive Management Team to look into issues related to salmonids?
I believe so, yes.
All right. Could I please have page ES-1 of this document? All right. Dr. Greenwood, I'm going to be asking you about something called findings and gaps in the report, specifically focusing on the gaps. And I direct you to this page so that we have a common understanding of what those terms mean. At the bottom of page ES-1, it says, key findings were typically characterized as having a medium or a high basis of knowledge and were judged by the SST, and that's the salmon scoping team, as being critical to our understanding of salmon and steelhead survival in the Delta in the context of hydrodynamic conditions and export operations. So that's what their meaning of key findings. Then they define key data gaps. Key data gaps reflect areas within the scope of the SST's review where the basis of knowledge was, can I please have page ES-2, typically low or minimal. The SST placed an emphasis on gaps that, if filled, would likely improve our understanding and inform our ability to more effectively manage water project operations and hydrodynamic conditions for improved salmonid survival. All right, and please scroll down a little bit further on page ES2. And so what is in this document in the executive summary is a table that has headings with a general topic and then a set of findings and gaps in information. And the first that I'd like to ask you about is on page ES-6. Could I have page ES-6, please?
I understand this is your last line of questioning, so
Yes.
about another 5-10 minutes?
I would say 5 minutes.
All right.
Probably. Yes, and this is the last document I'll be asking about. So this is in the section of findings and gaps regarding project effects. And if we could please scroll down a little further in the page. I want to ask you about some of the gaps in information. The second bullet, and I'll just read the first sentence, says, the evidence of relationship between exports and through Delta survival is inconclusive. The key findings presented in this table are supported by medium or high basis of knowledge, but our basis of knowledge on the relationship between exports and through Delta survival is low. Do you agree with that statement?
I would have to actually look at the section that they're citing there to see what they're basing that on.
Sure, and that's fair, and I have that, but I don't want to take the time today to go through that. Why don't we just go to the next page, page ES-7, and specifically the third bullet. The contribution of water project operations to the total mortality of juvenile salmonids has not been quantified. Do you agree with that statement?
Is this specific to a particular area, and how is total mortality being defined? Total mortality of juvenile salmonids from the San Joaquin River Basin, from the Sacramento River Basin, other river basins.
Yeah, I believe in this report, this is not tied to a specific geographic area in this section of the report.
Then it's hard for me to say. I mean, there have been studies that have looked at the influence of South Delta exports on mortality, for example, through the Delta, and these are the types of analyses that we included in our analysis of the Waterfix project. So I would say that there have been quantitative attempts, but regarding the total mortality of juvenile salmonids, if that includes all potential mortality, I'm not certain that there's been such an analysis.
All right, could you please scroll up the page just a little more, down to the fifth, I'm sorry, go down the page, thank you. The fifth bullet, it reads, it is unknown whether equivocal findings regarding the existence and nature of a relationship between exports and through Delta survival is due to the lack of a relationship, the concurrent and confounding influence of other variables, or the effect of low overall survival in recent years. Do you agree with that statement?
I mean, that statement is hard. Pulling out that bullet is hard to understand the full context around how that statement is being made. So I can't really say. I don't know which equivocal findings are being referred to specifically.
Okay, why don't we turn to page ES-9. And I'd like to ask you about the fifth bullet there. and that one reads, the magnitude of change in flow, water velocity, or water quality needed to elicit a behavioral or survival response by migrating juvenile salmonids has not been determined. Do you agree with that statement?
I'm struggling a little with what behavioral or survival response is really meaning in this context. I have seen analyses that correlate through delta survival with flow as one example. So I think it's a pretty broad statement without understanding the full context of what it's being made in.
Okay, fair enough, Dr. Greenwood. Would you agree that implementation of measures to protect juvenile salmonids in the South Delta should be accompanied by adaptive management?
Yes.
All right, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me check and make sure. Groups 5 and 6, any cross-examination? All right. Group 45 has switched place with Group 7, so does Group 45 have cross-examination? Not seeing anyone here. Group 8. Group 9. And what we'll do, Ms. Nichol has estimated an hour. Assuming that she's close to that, we will take our lunch break when she's done.
Thank you, Meredith Nichol, on behalf of North Delta Water Agency. I apologize to everyone for being between us and lunch.
You'll just have to make it interesting.
I will strive to do so.
And please begin by giving us an outline of the issues you will be covering and the witnesses you'll be cross-examining.
Okay. I have a few questions for Mr. Miller that pertain to the incidental take permit and how the project will be operated pursuant to the terms of that permit. I think that's all basically one category. And then I also have some questions for Ms. Smith. Categories there concern the 1981 contract with North Delta Water Agency, the modeling techniques, water quality results, as well as water level results. And I'll start with my questions for Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller, did you discuss your testimony with any of the witnesses that presented during part 1 of this hearing?
What do you mean by that in terms of discussing?
Well, did you discuss the contents of your testimony, either your written testimony or your oral testimony, with any of the witnesses that presented during part 1 of this hearing?
Objection. The question is vague. Does Ms. Nichol mean to also include witnesses who were both present in part 1 and in part 2, or simply those witnesses who are not before you in part 2?
I mean, I'm referring to any witnesses presenting during part 1.
Yes, I discussed it with my lead, John Lehi.
Anybody else?
I'm trying to think of everyone who has looked at it, and in terms of the actual active discussion, that's probably the main one.
Is there anybody else you can think of as you sit here today?
I'm trying to remember if I discussed it with Mr. Reyes here, but I can't remember.
Okay, that's fair. When you spoke with Mr. Lehi regarding your testimony, did you discuss with him whether any of the changes to the project that are described in your testimony would change any of the testimony that Mr. Lehi offered during part 1?
What changes are you referring to?
Well, I'm talking generally about any of the changes that are reflected by the CWF H3+ scenario that's been presented in your testimony and the testimony of others during this part.
So the refinement of some of the criteria as part of H3+?
Any of the changes, yeah.
Yes, I discussed that with Mr. Lehigh.
And did he tell you whether or not the changes in the project would change his testimony?
I don't remember that ever coming up, but we did discuss it being within the range of his testimony.
And the range of his testimony, you're referring to boundary 1 and boundary 2?
I think it would be the H3, H4 range.
Okay, but you never talked to him, or you don't recall whether he said that anything would change in his testimony?
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled for now. She's just reconfirming.
Yeah, he didn't mention that it would have, that H3 plus criteria would have changed his testimony.
All right, if we could pull up Mr. Miller's written testimony at DWR 1011 and page 11. Line 22 to 23. Mr. Miller, do you see at line 22 where your written testimony reads, the CWF H3 plus target outflow for April and May is determined by using the criteria used today for the SWRIE? Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And are you familiar with the incidental take permit that was issued for the California Waterfix project by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife?
Generally, yes.
And do you know if the criteria in that permit for April and May for spring outflow, is that the same or different than what was used here in your testimony?
So what was listed in the ITP was different than what I have shown here, but this was an example of how it could have been implemented and consistent with our incidental take application.
So is it your understanding that the California Waterfix project would be operated consistent with the San Joaquin IE, or will it be operated according to the terms of the incidental take permit?
It would be consistent with the terms of the incidental take permit.
And those terms are different than the San Joaquin IE, correct?
That's correct.
How are they different?
The April and May target outflow is based on a forecasted 8-river index.
And that's in the incidental take permit, but not in the San Joaquin IE ratio criteria that was used here, correct?
The San Joaquin River IE is right. It is how this example determined the April and May target.
And can you describe for us generally whether using the 8-river index table that you described is included in the incidental take permit, would that require higher levels of outflow than the San Joaquin IE ratio or lower?
In my example, it would be substantially the same.
What do you mean by substantially the same?
It would have resulted in substantially the same outflow.
So have you conducted an analysis of what, and by analysis I mean a quantitative analysis of what the outflows would have been if operated using the table in the incidental take permit?
I've looked at it. Yes.
What kind of analysis did you conduct?
A similar one.
Similar to?
What I showed today.
And did you use a model for that?
This is not a model. It's a taking historical data and then applying that criteria and adjusting exports for that criteria.
So you're saying you didn't use any model to analyze the incidental take permit criteria. Instead, you did this different analysis, more of a conceptual analysis?
Right, consistent with what I just showed in my testimony today. What I showed in my testimony today, or my presentation today.
And have you included in your testimony the results of the analysis of that you just described that you did with respect to the criteria in the incidental take permit?
I didn't show that in my testimony.
If we could turn to page 10 of Mr. Miller's testimony. At lines 26 to 28. Here, Mr. Miller, you testify, based on the modeling analysis completed for the ITP application, the frequency of outflow exceedance was consistent with current conditions, achieving the proposed spring outflow outflow requirement. Is the modeling analysis completed for the ITP application the same as the modeling that has been presented in part 2 here today?
The modeling analysis that I'm referring to here is not the analysis that that is part of my testimony. This modeling analysis was based on CalSim, developed for the incidental take permit application.
How is that analysis different?
The one I refer to here is CalSim. The one I did was basically just taking historical data and then modifying the exports for the criteria.
And I think I was asking a slightly different question, and it may be more appropriate for Mr. Reyes or others on the panel. But my question is whether the modeling analysis described that you identify here on page 10, is that the same modeling analysis that's been submitted in this part as CWF H3+?
I'm sorry, yeah, that would have, that's a more appropriate question for Mr. Reyes.
Okay.
Hi, Mr. Reyes for DWR. I'm not exactly familiar with what the model was used, or what model was used in the ITP application. So I don't know if that version is the exact same as the one that is being presented for this hearing process. So I don't know.
So does anybody on the panel know who conducted the modeling analysis that was used for the ITP application?
I believe DWR had consultants do that modeling that are not present here.
Okay. Mr. Miller, do you know if there were changes in the project criteria between the time of the modeling analysis that was completed for the incidental take permit application and the submittal of CWF H3+ as a modeling scenario for part 2?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question, please?
Sure. I'm trying to understand what you know about the modeling analysis completed for the incidental take permit application, which you have in your testimony. Were there changes to the project criteria, operating criteria, between the time of the incidental take permit application and the time when the CWF H3+ modeling scenario was submitted as evidence in this proceeding?
I'm not 100% sure, but my understanding is that the modeling for the incidental take permit application would be consistent with the final EIS, which I believe was the California H3+. But I need to look to Eric to confirm that.
If I could,
Mr.
if I
Reyes.
could offer something.
Thank you.
And I was trying to rack my brains while you were asking. So the ITP application, for the most part, the analysis in the ITP application, as I mentioned during my summary testimony, used the BAH 3+ modeling scenario. But the one analysis that I showed for longfin smelt included the spring outflow criteria that Mr. Miller was describing, but it didn't include, I believe it didn't include the Oldham Middle River flow fall criteria in it. So it did include the spring, but it didn't include the fall. And that was just used to illustrate the potential differences as far as biological analysis for the longfin smelt January to June average X2 analysis, which I reference in my written testimony.
Hold on a second. Mr. Becerra?
Yes, I'd like to move to strike Dr. Greenwood's answer. The entire witness panel just testified that no one on the panel knows anything about this modeling that's in this testimony. And now I apologize if it's Mr. or Dr. Greenwood, has just summarized via hearsay testimony outside the scope, I think, of his written testimony, what that modeling purports to show. If there is no witness on this panel with sufficient knowledge of this modeling to provide adequate testimony, they should not be attempting to testify about it.
Mr. Mizell?
This was a response a direct response to the question by Ms. Nickel. If she is inquiring to people's understanding about the modeling and Dr. Greenwood has an answer to that, I think it's appropriate for him to provide it to this hearing. And I would also say that the scope of a witness's response to a question that goes beyond the scope of the direct testimony should not be limited by the scope of their direct testimony.
Repeat that last one for me.
If Ms. Nickel is going to ask questions that go beyond the scope of my witness's direct testimony, they should be able to provide answers.
She did not ask Dr. Greenwood that question.
Well, and maybe I misunderstand the organization of the panel structure, but it was my understanding from part one that questions to an individual are actually questions to the panel, and that's the reason why we have the panel set up. And thus, Dr. Greenwood providing an answer is actually appropriate and helpful.
Fair enough. Mr. Becerra?
I believe the board's October 30th, 2015 notice of this hearing and various other places have a rule that says modeling must be presented with sufficient documentation for everyone to understand the modeling. We just had the entire panel admit by their silence they do not know this modeling, they do not have knowledge of the modeling, they have not presented the ITP modeling in this hearing, so they should not be testifying about it.
Mr. Jackson?
This is probably something that would be coming up regularly. The ITP decision was not made at the time that the testimony came in. So there is very little opportunity for anyone to know what the differences are, or for anyone to cross-examine about it. And frankly, I think the cross-examination demonstrates the problem of having the moving target. I can understand why only the ITP application was considered in the testimony, because that's all they had. But we can't answer these questions from these witnesses. We would need the people who made the decision at Cal Fish and Wildlife to be present to cross-examine.
So that was a support for Mr. Becerra's objection?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Morris?
Stephanie Morris, State Water Contractors. 2 quick points. I'm not supporting Mr. Becerra's statement. I wanted to clarify that Dr. Greenwood clearly said he was relying on modeling in his testimony and explaining his answer based on the modeling in his testimony. Secondly, as evidenced by Mr. Jackson's last statement, it seems to be confusion based on ambiguity in the question about the modeling for the ITP that was done by Department of Fish and Wildlife or the modeling for the BA that was submitted by the department to Fish and Wildlife, and I think that that's creating a lot of confusion.
Fair point, Ms. Morris. We'll get back to that, Ms. Nickel. Ms. Desjardins.
I hereby join in the objections by Mr. Becerra, and I wanted to further state that court decisions about evidence that's admitted, I'm under Evidence Code 801 and 802, particularly Sargon Pharmaceuticals versus University of California, require that complex scientific evidence such as this modeling, that they establish sufficient foundation. And if nobody on this panel has done the modeling or is a modeler with the expertise, Dr. Greenwood does not have that expertise to testify, then the ITP modeling simply lacks foundation, and neither the testimony nor the exhibits that are based on it should be admitted. Thank you.
Mr. Becerra, you who started all this.
Yes, sorry about that. Ms. Morris is correct. There is confusion here about the modeling. Mr. Reyes has presented a great deal of modeling. However, as I understand it, it was ambiguous to me in the written testimony what Mr. Miller was talking about in terms of ITP modeling. We have now confirmed that is something that Mr. Reyes has not presented. No one in this hearing has presented it. And on that basis, I mean, Ms. Desjardins is absolutely right. There is no foundation for any discussion of this modeling in this hearing. And we should not have testimony that is supported by some kind of modeling that no one in this hearing is presenting or has seen or can be asked about.
Mr. Miller.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm looking at that sentence, which has garnered a lot of attention. When you say based on the modeling analysis completed for the ITP application, what specifically are you referring to? Where is it in the submittals from DWR for Part 2? And to what extent did you review that modeling for the purpose of your testimony?
So and I think Mr. Reyes was correct in that this is the BA H3+. The ITP application modeling was the BA H3+ that Mr. Reyes showed in slide 7 of his PowerPoint.
So you are referring to modeling conducted by the department, submitted to Fish and Wildlife?
Yes.
And to what extent did you review that?
Very minorly. I saw the 3-month average outflow to make this conclusion.
But that modeling, which was conducted by DWR, has been submitted as part of Mr. Ray's testimony, and Mr. Reyes is able to answer questions on it. Mr. Reyes, I'm looking at you now.
Yes, if it's BA H3+, then yes, I can
And
answer
Mr.
that.
Miller has just confirmed that it was so. True?
Yes, I believe so.
Do you know so?
Ms. Hearing Officer Dodick, if I may interject, it is submitted as DWR 1036.
All right. On that basis, Mr. Becerra, your objection is overruled. Good luck, Ms. Nicole.
I'm not sure I heard an answer from Mr. Miller on your last question, Hearing Officer Dodick.
What was my last question,
I
Ms.
believe it
Nicole?
was, are you sure that and I read this sentence to be modeling done in connection with the incidental take permit application, not the permit, but the department's application. That modeling was the same as the BA H3+ modeling that has been presented by Mr. Reyes. Is that correct?
I believe so. It is part of the record. I'm having trouble remembering exactly which one, but I'm pretty sure it is the BA H3+.
Would I be able to provide some additional thoughts?
Please.
Could we scroll down on the, I'm just curious what the next sentence is on the, where it says this is further discussed, DWR 1016. Would we be able to pull up my summary testimony? Is DWR 1029.
Oh, it does refer to Mr. Ray's testimony there, which is 1016.
And then slide 17, please. This slide, which I discussed yesterday, illustrates modeling that doesn't, it includes the spring outflow criteria that Mr. Miller was summarizing an example for. And this was part of that. This table here is taken from the ITP application. We also have an appendix 4D, I believe, from the ITP application that discusses the difference between the BAH3+ and the, I'm not saying CWH3+, it was the BAH3+, but including the Longfin smelt spring outflow, which I call here on this table PP parentheses with Longfin smelt spring outflow criteria. So this was, as I mentioned yesterday in my summary testimony, this was the only biological analysis that we had for this scenario, which is not CWFH3+, but it includes the spring outflow criteria from CWFH3+.
So, Dr. Greenwood, is the spring outflow criteria in the BA CWF, no, is it just BA H3+? Is that what we're calling it? BA H3+ modeling the same or different from the spring outflow criteria contained in the CWF H3+ modeling?
It is, the CWF H3+ includes the additional March requirement, whereas the BA H3+ includes the San Joaquin River ITE.
In March?
Ratio, no, April and May.
Okay, thank you.
To achieve similar overall March to May.
Okay, thank you. I think I understand now that the BA H3+ modeling, which is the modeling analysis referred to in Mr. Miller's testimony as the ITP application modeling, has different spring outflow criteria than CWF H3+. Is that correct, Mr. Miller? Is that consistent with your understanding?
I think I would have to review quickly my notes.
If I could answer.
Sure.
So I have, if you pull up my testimony, DWR 1028. And go to slide 7, please. So this simple chart was meant to point out the differences between the progression of the modeling. And so BAH3+, as you can see on the right, has updated spring outflow, which, like Dr. Greenwood confirmed, has the March piece added in there, and April, May with the San Joaquin IE. CWF H3+ then further updated the spring outflow largely in that April-May period, is where some changes to the targets and maybe the off-ramps were changed for CWF H3+ or the NOD. But both the BA H3+ and Waterfix H3+ have a spring outflow criteria, and as if you scroll down, let's see. To slide 16. Here's where, you know, in the what I'm calling the DW epilogue, which is the document with the long name. I'll have to recite that back to you in a little bit when I can look it up. But in that analysis, they compared the BA H3+ to the Waterfix H3+ and found that the implications to water supply, surface water, water quality, and fisheries resources were found to remain similar. Oh, sorry. Sure. Surface water, water quality, and fisheries resources were found to remain similar to the FERIS alternative 4A. So even though there was a slight change in that spring outflow criteria, I think the implications to everything else was similar.
I'd just like to clarify, if we can go back to the diagram that Mr. Reyes showed. The BAH3+ updated spring outflow criteria is the inclusion of the San Joaquin River ITE for April and May. The CWF H3+ adds in the March. So March, per the table that Mr. Miller alluded to, April, San Joaquin River ITE.
Mr. Reyes, I'd like to follow up with something I think I heard you say in the changes in the spring outflow criteria between the BA H3+ scenario and the CWF H3+ scenario. Were there changes to how the San Joaquin IE ratio was used in April and May?
Yes, if we could go to slide 14 on my presentation. So this should explain what the changes are. It would be the last two columns, the differences there.
Okay, so is the only change in April and May to include a restriction or remove, I can't tell from the language there, remove the restriction to apply up to a minimum outflow target. Does that say maximum? Maximum outflow target of 44,500 CFS, or were there any other changes to April and May?
I believe that's the only change there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd like to go back to Mr. Miller. And if you'd like, we can pull it back up. I'd like to look at the sentence again on page 10 of Mr. Miller's testimony, which is DWR 1011. So after that discussion, is your opinion on page 10 at lines 26 to 28 based on the BA H3+ modeling or based on the CWF H3+ modeling?
So based on the table that Mr. Reyes just had up, it would have been the California Waterfix CWF H3+.
But that's not the same as the modeling analysis completed for the ITP application, right?
That is my understanding. That was the one done from for the ITP application.
And yet your opinion is based on CWF H3+, a different modeling scenario?
Objection misstates the witness's testimony.
Well, the witness has clarified because he's confused me now.
Yeah. So the ITP application, I'm fairly clear now, based on that last table, that the ITP application did use the California Waterfix H3 plus because they used the March, March outflow target and the April-May based on the San Joaquin IE. So we're talking about the ITP application, correct?
We're talking about whatever you put in your testimony.
Which is the ITP application, modeling for the ITP application.
And you're now saying that it's the CWF H3 plus, not the BA H3 plus that you just said less than 10 minutes ago.
I hopefully I caveated my certainty as being not very certain. So
if I may, Hearing Officer Dodek, Mr. Miller is being scrutinized as to the assumptions in a modeling run. He simply looked at the results when he was doing his testimony, which is what his testimony says here.
Yes,
he
but
reviews results.
we're trying to ascertain which results he looked at.
He reviewed the results listed as the ITP application. What was precisely in the ITP application results is a question that the modelers are very capable of answering, as they just have. If there's any inconsistency, it's due to the fact Mr. Miller didn't look into the assumptions behind the results he was given. He reviewed the results and applied those to his testimony.
So, Mr. Reyes, help me out. For the ITP application,
Yes, so to me
What
here,
was-
this is where maybe there's some disconnect because I'm dealing with the BA H3 plus and Waterfix H3 plus, and that's what I know and what I've put together in my testimony. Now, some of these models have been used in the ITP application I'm aware of, but I myself am not involved with this ITP application, so I don't know ultimately which one they ended up going with. So if Aaron is saying, if Mr. Miller is saying that he looked at modeling that had a March outflow criteria in it, then that would point to the Waterfix H3 plus. And that's all I could say about that. I can't say whether it is or not.
are you sure that what you looked at has the March requirements?
yes, yes.
Just to clarify again, there was this intermediate, if you like, scenario between BA H3 plus and CWF H3 plus, which had the CWF H3 plus spring criteria in it, as I showed in my table from my PowerPoint. It didn't have the fall or the middle river flow criteria from CWF H3 plus. So it has the spring. The ITP application has the spring outflow criteria included also in CWF H3 plus.
Perhaps, Ms. Nickel, if you were to proceed with your line of questioning, we could further flesh this out. What was it that you were trying to get at by questioning lines 26 and 27 and 28?
Really two things. What is the modeling analysis completed for the ITP application? And I'm not certain that I know the answer to that.
I'm not certain that I know the answer to that.
And then secondly, what was the basis for the opinion in the second part of the sentence? The frequency of outflow exceedance was consistent with current conditions, achieving the proposed spring outflow requirement. And how does that relate to the spring outflow criteria that's contained in the incidental take permit? And I don't know that I got the answer to either of those questions.
I don't know that you did either. Could anyone please help?
I can try. If we pull up, please, the ITP application, Appendix 4D.
I believe it's 107. No.
DWR, one, is it?
Yeah,
DWR
107.
1036 is the
Oh, it's-
ITP application.
Oh, sorry.
Appendix 4D. For D, sorry, D for David. As I mentioned, most of our analysis was based on the BAH3 plus modeling scenario. During the development of the ITP application and in coordination with Department of Fish and Wildlife, as I mentioned in my written testimony, the potential need for additional spring outflow was addressed, and so this is outflow beyond just what was in the BAH3 plus modeling scenario. And so this appendix 4D here illustrates, and this is prepared by me because I was interested from a biological perspective what the differences were. And so if we scroll down in this appendix, this shows, if we go to the section that would be on delta outflow, please. This shows the differences between what's called PP here, which is the BAH3 plus modeling scenario, and then PPLFS is this intermediate scenario that includes the spring outflow criteria. I think a little bit further down, and then further down. So I just give some examples. I give some examples here of the differences between these different scenarios in relation to the no action alternative. And the purpose of this was to illustrate, given that we have this, given that through the process of the ITP permit application, this additional spring outflow criteria was included, what is the difference between these different scenarios? And if we scroll down a bit further, we'll see delta outflow. So, as I mentioned, this isn't CWFH3 plus. What's being labeled here is PPLFS. But it does include the spring outflow criteria from the CWFH3 plus. Referring back to the initial question, which was to that sentence, I don't know which specific of these different scenarios is being referred to by Mr. Miller, but this is just to clarify that there was the spring outflow criteria as proposed under CWFH3 plus was represented in the ITP application.
So the analysis I was basing my opinion on was comparing that ITP application modeling to an existing condition modeling. And it looked at the exceedance of that 3-month outflow, and that's going back to my my testimony. Can we pull that up? And so that's where I determined that it was consistent with current conditions, was based on that comparison.
So was it a comparison using the BA-H3 plus modeling, or was it a different scenario, including this intermediate scenario that Dr. Greenwood has just described?
It's what was used in the ITP application, which had a March based outflow target, March outflow target based on an 8-river index, forecasted 8-river index, and then the April and May based on the San Joaquin inflow to export ratio.
Okay, so I think I understand that you don't recall the name of the scenario or which of the various scenarios that have been discussed here today, but is that correct? You don't recall the name of the scenario?
I keep going back and forth. I thought it was one and now it's the other, but I don't remember the name of it, obviously. Yeah.
Okay, but you do recall that the spring outflow criteria was based for March on the 8-river index and for April and May based on the San Joaquin IE.
Yes.
And do you recall if in April and May the scenario included the elimination of the requirement of the outflow requirement when outflows are greater than 44,500 CFS?
I don't remember if that was part of the ITP application.
Okay. I think we've exhausted that line of questions. If I can switch gears, and I have a few more questions for Mr. Miller. So, Mr. Miller, you testified both in your oral summary of your testimony as well as your written testimony that DWR would not take any action other than reducing exports to the south of the Delta in order to achieve the March through May spring outflow criteria. Is that correct?
That's the that was what the example I provided. Yes.
And is it your testimony that DWR would not take any other action to meet the spring outflow criteria contained in the incidental take permit other than reducing exports?
Well, DWR will follow whatever state and federal law that there is.
So are you saying that it's possible that DWR might take other actions other than reducing exports?
But we're going to follow whatever state and federal criteria that we are required to.
So if one of those state criteria is the incidental take permit spring outflow criteria, is it possible that DWR would take actions other than reducing exports to meet that criteria?
Are you talking about the actual ITP, incidental take permit?
I am.
Objection. She's talking about the actual ITP permit, then she's misquoting the permit. So I'm going to assume the question is in the hypothetical, in which case I don't have any problem with Mr. Miller answering it.
Ms. Nichol, do you wish to clarify your question?
No, I'm asking a question. I'll try again. Maybe that will help. Is it possible that DWR would take any action other than reducing exports in order to meet the spring outflow criteria contained in the incidental take permit?
My understanding of what the incidental take permit requires is only export reductions.
Okay, so I think the answer is no. And let me try this. Is it possible that DWR would release water from upstream storage in order to meet the incidental take permit spring outflow criteria?
Objection calls for speculation as to what the department may or may not do in some future hypothetical she has not set before the questioner.
Overruled.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sure. Is it possible that DWR would release water from upstream storage in order to meet the spring outflow criteria contained in the incidental take permit?
Not the way it's written today. The incidental take permit.
Are you aware of any operating criteria for the California Waterfix project that would preclude DWR from releasing water from upstream storage in order to meet the outflow criteria in the incidental take permit?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
I'll try. Actually, if you could read the question back, please.
Are you aware of any operating criteria for the California Waterfix project that would preclude DWR from releasing water from upstream storage in order to meet the outflow criteria in the incidental take permit?
I don't think there's any criteria that limits our upstream operations. Is that
your understanding? So the answer is no.
Objection misstates the witness's testimony. I believe that was clearly he does not know. He answered her question with a question.
Answer her question. Her question was a yes or no question, and your answer is? Are you aware of any operating criteria that would limit
DWR's ability to release water from upstream storage in order to meet the spring outflow criteria in the incidental take permit?
Yeah, I don't know.
So you're not aware of any?
I'm not aware of any.
Thank you. Are you aware of any analysis done by DWR or anybody else of what the effect would be if DWR were to release additional water from upstream storage in order to meet the incidental take permit?
Objection calls for speculation.
Just what you're aware of.
Just what he's aware of, overruled.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any.
Mr. Miller, are you aware of whether or not Reclamation is named as a permittee on the incidental take permit?
I don't know if they are a permittee or not. But maybe Ms. White.
may, yeah, Ms. may know the answer.
I'm sorry, I haven't reviewed that in quite some time. I don't think so, but I'm not sure.
Let me try it this way, and this is a question for you, Ms. White. Are you aware of any commitment that the Bureau of Reclamation has made to take any action at all to achieve the flows required by the incidental take permit?
I think in general, Reclamation intends to coordinate with DWR to meet all applicable state and federal regulations. But as far, I have not seen a particular operating plan or commitment that water would be released from upstream CBP reservoirs to meet the requirements that are in the ITP.
And by saying the Bureau of Reclamation would coordinate, are you talking about the Coordinated Operations Agreement, or are you talking about something else?
I think it would go well beyond the Coordinated Operations Agreement. That would certainly be a part of it, but basically how we coordinate to meet any requirement and specific. I don't know if this is going in and out or not. It sounds like it is to me. Typically, we have a set of actions. We coordinate on which those actions are, and then the accounting is done through the Coordinated Operations Agreement.
And isn't it true that the Coordinated Operations Agreement requires generally that obligations in Delta outflow be shared between the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Water Resources?
Yes, that's correct.
And so would the spring outflow criteria for the incidental take permit also be shared under the Coordinated Operations Agreement?
I think that's something that we don't know the answer to yet. The Coordinated Operations Agreement also states that the agreement should be reviewed when there's major new infrastructure. I don't remember the exact quote, so that's something that we need to discuss with DWR to determine how we're going to move forward on meeting all state and federal obligations as it relates to this new piece of infrastructure.
Okay. I think that's all of the questions I had for Mr. Miller. That took a lot longer to get through than I anticipated.
How extensive are your questions for Ms. Smith?
There are more.
Okay. In that case, I would suggest we take a lunch break.
Okay, thank you.
And we will return at 1:30.